Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Catherine Weinrob, and on behalf of the Alexandria Historical Society and co-sponsor, the Office of Historic Alexandria, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture, A Short History of Shooters Hill and the construction of the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. Just a reminder that we will take questions at the end of the lecture. You can find that chat button at the bottom of the screen under the slides. Our technical support this evening will be Michelle Longo. You may see her hanging out at the chat as well. Our speaker this evening is Mark Tabbert. Mark has a master's degree in American history and for the last 15 years has worked as the director of the Library and Museum Collection at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial Association. While he has previously authored 4 books, he is most excited about the 2 upcoming publications. The first book will document George Washington's membership in and relationship with Freemasonry, titled A Deserving Brother, George Washington and Freemasonry. It will be published by the University of Virginia Press next February. To complete this book, he was a 2018 research fellow at George Washington's Mount Vernon. The second book, commemorating the upcoming centennial anniversary of the memorial, will be published in 2023 and will include newsletters and images providing an institutional history. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tabbert.
Hello. Hello. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm on vacation. I'm not in Virginia, and it's great to be here. So I'm in my hometown in Iowa. I'm just going to show you a quick picture of my hometown, and then we'll start because I'm very proud of it. So this is my hometown in Burlington, Iowa, on the Mississippi River. You're looking down the river towards Missouri. So you're looking south, and on the left-hand side is Illinois, and on the right-hand side is Iowa. And the bridge, the big bridge across the river is Route 34, and I'm sitting in a friend's house about 6 blocks from there. And then a little further down the river is the Burlington Northern Amtrak old CB&Q railroad bridge across the Mississippi, which was very, very important, in which a lot of, again, Amtrak trains, if you're traveling out to California, cross the Mississippi River there. Okay, so enough boosterism from Iowa. So this is a short presentation on the history of Shooters Hill, and we'll talk about the landscaping more than the construction of the memorial, but we can talk about the construction of the memorial in the questions as you have them. So I'm going to try and run through this history fairly quickly, and I do speak quickly, and I have some material to read. So if I get too fast, I'll ask Catherine or Michelle just to slow me down. So the first image, of course, is just of Alexandria, and looking up King Street to the end, you'll see Shooters Hill. So I always like to give an outline so people know where we're going to go. I'm going to just do a chronology from the 1760s all the way really quickly up until the memorial was starting to begin in 1910, and then construction began in 1922. And then we'll talk about the landscaping plans and the Olmsted brothers and the tension between construction of the building and construction of and landscaping the hill. And then we'll sort of talk a little bit more about how things progressed after 1932 and try to bring it up to the present day. And then if you have questions about what's going on at the memorial right now and what's going to happen in 2023 with the Cornerstone Centennial Celebration, I'll be happy to answer as many questions as you can. So without that, we'll keep going. So first thing I always try to do is remind people of the Memorial Association's mission. While we have a very large building, and the building is central to our mission is truly educational, and we are working to extend that beyond just having folks come and visit the building. We're working towards developing new programs and new ideas to talk about extending and educating people about Washington's virtues and character and vision. And so that's our mission. About the Memorial Association where I work, it was founded in 1910. It from representatives of all the state Grand Lodges in the United States today, there are 52 Grand Lodges in the United States. That's the 50 states plus District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Back in 1948, there was about 49. I don't believe there was a Grand Lodge. There was not a Grand Lodge of Alaska or Hawaii at that time. And from those 52 members, they select 21 members to sit on our board of directors. Those board of directors serve for 3-year terms. And then a few of those board of directors are elected as officers, vice presidents, and then ascend through a 2-year term to become president. And those officers are usually selected more on a geographical basis. So the current president of the Memorial Association, Dr. Claire Touch, who is a veterinarian from Maine, he will be succeeded in a couple of years by Kenneth Nagel from California, who's retired Navy captain. And after that, I believe it is Thomas Sturgeon from Pennsylvania. So that's how the Memorial Association works. As Catherine mentioned, I've worked there for 15 years and enjoy it very much. Okay, so then the other side of that, excuse me, before the Memorial Association was founded, there, of course, there's a lodge, Masonic Lodge in Alexandria. The first lodge was chartered in 1783 from Pennsylvania, and then it was rechartered in 1788 under the Grand Lodge of Virginia. And Washington was, George Washington joined that lodge, was made a member of that lodge in 1784. In 1812, the lodge opened a museum, which was one of the first public or semi-public museums in the United States, where they had a lot of relics and artifacts, both related to Washington, but the history of Northern Virginia, and then just curious artifacts that were brought from overseas and around the country. That museum existed and survived through the Civil War, but there was a fire in the 1870s that destroyed some of their relics. But the big push, the really spark that happened that led towards the memorial was in 1899, when about 200 Freemasons from all over the country came back to do a centennial commemoration of Washington's funeral. And when there was this gathering of Freemasons from around the country, while the lodge was very proud that they hosted that, they realized that they had a lot of material that was very, very in danger of being destroyed and damaged. And also tourism was increasing in Alexandria as the trolley line opened down, not only just from DC down to Alexandria, but of course the trolley line that opened down to Mount Vernon. So as I mentioned, in 1910, the association was formed. From 1910 to 1922, they acquired enough land, and then they broke ground, which I'll get deeper into that. And then in 1932, they built the building and they finished it in time for the dedication during the bicentennial celebration of Washington's birth. So the material I'm going to talk about is largely taken from Michael Miller's article called The Saga of Shooter's Hill, which is in the Historical Society of Fairfax journal, published in 1983. And I would encourage you to find that. And then the material that I have and used for this speech really comes from the archives of the Memorial Association, the minutes of their meetings, executive committee, and that material, which is more and better organized. And if there were specific research things that people were interested in, we do have the archives better organized, especially the list of contractors and subcontractors. Okay, so the first thing we always talk about, of course, is shooters versus shooters, excuse me. So we call it shooters, but obviously some places and in periods of times it's been called shooters. But from at least 1787 through the 1860s, the hill was usually named after a man with the surname of Shooter, who lived in the area in the 1740s. There were also examples before 1861 of the name Shooter, which could refer to Shooter's Hill in London. During the Civil War, when Fort Ellsworth stood upon the hill, it became known as Shooters due to the munitions being discharged there. But since the last 15 or 20 years, the Memorial Association, we call it Shooters. And as far as I know, the city of Alexandria calls it Shooters with a U. And I think that works for everybody. I don't hear anybody demanding that it go back to double O's. So when I talk about Shooter's Hill, roughly we're talking from King Street to Carlisle, sloping around to Roberts Lane, then back down to Duke Street to Callahan. So here's a nice aerial photograph of the area taken during the construction of the memorial. You'll see this again later in the presentation, but we mean, when I say Shooter's Hill, it's really basically obviously from King Street and the railroad station back to behind the memorial and back behind the water reservations, bordered by King Street and Duke Street. So the 1690s to the 1700s, the first documentation of the hill dates to 1669. It was in the property of Robert Howson, who transferred it to John Alexander for 6,000 pounds of tobacco. Nearly 80 years later, Alexander's great-grandson sold the hill to local merchant John Mills in 1779. Mills built a large house on a 20-acre plot, but he died suddenly in December of 1783. The hill remained unsold until 1790, when Colonel Ludlow Lee, who was born in 1760 and died in 1836, purchased the plot. He was the son of Richard Henry Lee, and he had served in the American Revolution on Lafayette's staff and was present at Lord Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. He was later a delegate to and Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates. His sister Hannah married George Washington's nephew, Corbin Washington. Colonel Lee expanded the estate by adding further acreage and building a large mansion that faced east, overlooking Alexandria and the Potomac River Valley. In late 1790s and early 1800s, his estate hosted the large Lee clan and many affluent citizens and planters. Fox hunts, barbecues, balls, banquets, and other social events were played out on Shooter's Hill. But sadly, Colonel Lee's wife died in 1795, and in 1799, he sold the property to Benjamin Delaney. Let me go back. So during this period, the newly formed federal government was searching for a permanent home, and in July 1790, the U.S. Congress passed the Residence Act, designating a 100 square mile area between Maryland and Virginia as a federal district. And despite many claims, there's no evidence that Thomas Jefferson ever, or anybody else really, ever recommended that Shooter's Hill be the site of the U.S. Capitol. That story was really made up by the PR committee of the George Washington Masonic Memorial Association, really back in the 1920s, to help encourage fundraising, as far as I can tell. But it is true, of course, that the District of Columbia ran through Alexandria, and of course the boundary stones were placed, of which the third one going north and west from Jones Point is at the base of Shooter's Hill. And that was the first one placed at Jones Point, was done by the Alexandria Freemasons on April 15th, 1791. And there's an image of what I believe is the replacement stone. Okay, so Benjamin Delaney. In 1800, Benjamin Delaney, who was born in 1752 and 1815, purchased the land. He was a third-generation Irish American and had been a good friend of George Washington. Delaney married Elizabeth French, who was Washington's ward, and together they had a large family of 12 children. They expanded the Ludlow home into a grand mansion similar in scope and size to Mount Vernon to their south and Arlington House to the north. Besides being a highly active and civic-minded businessman, Delaney was a member of the Masonic Lodge in Alexandria, both when it was Lodge 39 under the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania and Lodge 22 when it was under the Grand Lodge of Virginia. He was present when the lodge elected George Washington an honorary member of the lodge in 1784, and he was also there when the lodge participated in the cornerstone ceremony of the U.S. Capitol, which Washington, of course, also participated in. He passed away in 1815, and then when his wife Elizabeth died in 1824, she willed the property to her sons, and the sons fought amongst themselves, and it was eventually her grandson, Henry Delaney, who eventually purchased most of the hill. And between 1829 and Henry's death in 1839, the mansion house was further expanded, and a large herd of Durham cows grazed upon the hill. Besides the extended family and the Alexandria neighbors, many travelers enjoyed Delaney hospitality. Regretfully, the Grand Mansion burned to the ground in 1840, but there has been archaeological excavations over the last several years that has uncovered large sections and different buildings related to that mansion. After the fire, Henry's widow came to erect a smaller cottage and then turned the rest of the hill over for agriculture and the occasional community celebrations of Independence Day and other events. And there's an image of the archaeological site. They're finished digging on the hill, so the area's been recovered, but it's basically, you can see where it's at, and that's the location of the larger buildings. And you can see that the building, the mansion was looking east over down into the city of Alexandria, or the town at that time. So in the 1850s, the citizens of Alexandria determined to create a public works, and Benjamin Holloway was selected to undertake the enterprise, and he selected the southern portion of Shooter's Hill as a primary reservoir. And by 1852, water was flowing through the pipes down the hill, and the reservoirs were continued in use until, I believe, the late 1990s, when Virginia American Water opened a new water treatment plant north of town, if I'm not mistaken. So you can see this image at the bottom of the screen is from the about 1930 or so, because we can see the progression of the memorial being built, and you can see, of course, the two reservoirs that are still there today, but they're completely empty. They're great swamps for the migrating ducks and geese. So Fort Ellsworth, on the western half of Shooter's Hill, the U.S. Army built a series of forts around DC, of course, to defend it during the Confederate, during the Civil War, and their fort, Fort Ellsworth, was named after Colonel Ellsworth, or Lieutenant Elmer Ellsworth, who was killed in Alexandria at the very beginning of the war. And the fort protected the western approaches and overlooked Cameron Run Valley. And during this time, the hill was, of course, completely stripped of all trees and most vegetation, not just for firewood and construction material, but to ensure clear fields of fire for the fort's large guns. The fort, of course, never fired a shot in anger, and after the end of the war, it was largely abandoned. But you can see an outline in the grass and the back acreage of the memorial. If you're in the tower, you can see that there's a darker green, what would you call an arrowhead or a letter V, that you can still see the remaining outline of the bastion of the fort. There's the typical image of where the fort was at. Okay, 1865 to 1900, of course, this town was devastated by the war and basically stagnated during the war, and then slow to recover after through the rest of the 19th century. I believe that the population in Alexandria only grew by 1,000 people between 1870 and 1900, something like that. So the hill and the rest of the fort were largely left to nature, and children and adults again started to use the hill more for recreation purposes and just open land. In 1900, the Alexandria Golf Club was formed, and a links course was laid out, and a kind of clubhouse was erected on the hill in the early 1900s. One of the big changes that affected the hill and for the most of the 20th century was, I believe in 1905, a new railroad station was opened, the one that's currently there at the base of the hill. And that really set the tone for opening up the idea of land west of the railroad station for being more suburban and area and more residential area, opening up at that. So as people might come and commute into the District of Columbia by taking the train out of the Alexandria station. So that just encouraged the city to grow and the population to grow. So in 1908, real estate developers purchased 140 acres on the hill, including those still owned by the Delaney families, and proposed dividing the hill in half, with the western half would be parceled into over 250 residential lots, and the eastern half became in a George Washington Park. By 1909, the plans and funding for the park were well advanced. With plans drawn up for a statue, even the base of the statue was dedicated, and revenue was raised for the sale of through commemorative coins, which the memorial has a couple sets of those coins in its collection, and then full support from local and even national politicians. Also in 1909, the Wright brothers demonstrated their airplane to the War Department by flying it from Fort Myers in Arlington down and around Shooter's Hill all the way back to Fort Myers, which is a 14-minute flight. And Orville Wright flew that plane. I think it's one of the most extraordinary things to contemplate what the reaction would be for people to see an airplane flying for the very first time. It must have been extraordinary. So in 1910, as I mentioned, the Memorial Association was organized by a man named Charles Callahan. Callahan was born in 1852 and died in 1944. He was the city of Alexandria's main tax collector and appraiser for over 40 years, an extraordinary man of extraordinary talent. He did not become a Freemason, did not join the lodge until he was well into his 40s, and he joined even after his older brother was a Freemason and had passed away. He had a great zeal and love for George Washington and for Northern Virginia, and he wanted to do something to preserve the history and the materials that were in the lodge hall, which was above City Hall. And he was concerned of that material being destroyed. And so the original idea was that the lodge itself was looking to build a brand new lodge building and get out from the upper floors of City Hall, and they wanted to build a fireproof building. So the lodge and Callahan owned some parcels, I'm not sure how many, but some land on Shooter's Hill. And that was sort of, sorry, what am I doing here? Excuse me, beg your pardon. That was the beginning of thinking about building something on Shooter's Hill. The lodge preferred to stay in Old Town because most of the brothers lived within walking distance. But the Shooter's Hill was an option, especially as the city was expanding west. So in 1910, delegates from the various Grand Lodges met in Alexandria and formed the association. And the lodge, as I mentioned, wished to leave the City Hall and build their own temple. But there was, of course, the George Washington Park on the eastern end of Shooter's Hill, and I have not really been able to discover how that project really collapsed. But by 1915, the Memorial Association was reasonably established, and support from around the country had raised sufficient money to at least guarantee a stronger progress and the likelihood that the project would begin. So from what I understand, in 1915, the real estate developers sold 28 acres of the eastern slope to the city. And then the next year, the city affirmed or felt confident enough to then sell those lots to the Memorial Association. And in 1916, with the sufficient land in hand, then the Memorial Association officially selected Shooter's Hill as the site to build a memorial to George Washington with a lodge room and a museum for Alexandria Lodge. But the sale of the land from the city to the Memorial Association was on a stipulation that the building had to be built within 10 years, or at least well underway. I have found in the Memorial Association's 1917 annual report that has a striking description of why that hill was selected. So I'll just quote here. On every hand, the view stretches away for miles, and the panorama, near and distant, including places, objects, and landmarks that are indissolubly associated with our country's history and that are calculated to arouse the enthusiasm and inspire the zeal of all who appreciate American citizenship and glory in the achievements of our fathers. So that's the beginning of the promotion to raise the money and to start the project as a construction project. Between 1917 and 1921, the first president of the Memorial Association, Thomas Shyrock, whose mothers and family were from Alexandria, he was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Maryland for 30 years, an extraordinary human being. He died, and he was succeeded by a past Grand Master of Pennsylvania, Lewis Waters. And Lewis Waters was another extraordinary man. He was Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania. He was a great industrialist. He built many orphanages and sponsored expeditions to the Brazilian rainforest, and was a colonel in the Pennsylvania Regiment in the Spanish-American War. Extraordinary man. And so and then of course World War I occurred, and the American participation in World War I, and there were shortages. And then after World War I, there was not just influenza, but also railroad strikes and other things. So during that time period, the Memorial Association really focused on organizing and finding the resources and securing support from Freemasonry around the country. And by 1921, the crisis in the country had largely passed, and enough land was acquired and enough money was secured to really start the project. So this is a groundbreaking image in 1921 on the top of Shooter's Hill, and on the left is Lewis Waters from Pennsylvania, and on the right is Charles Callahan, of which Callahan Drive is named for, of course, at the bottom of the hill. So, and that's a really wonderful image. So landscaping the hill. I'm not going to talk too much about the construction of the building itself, but we're going to focus on the landscaping. So the association acquired more land around the hill. Its effort after 1916, as I mentioned, was to secure more funding. It was not until 1921 that the board member Andrew Randall, who was from Texas, proposed hiring a landscape architect. And today the association owns 37 acres of land on Shooter's Hill. After some discussion, Melvin Maynard Johnson of Massachusetts, who's a very important figure in his own right, and who was dean of the Boston College Law School, volunteered to contact the preeminent landscape architecture firm in the nation, Olmsted Brothers of Brookline, Massachusetts. Motivated to ensure mutual supporting designs, Johnson secured Olmsted's services before the association selected the memorial architect, Harvey Wiley Corbett. So the board's point of view, and certainly Melvin Johnson's point of view, was that the architect and the landscape architect should be working in tandem so that both of their designs complemented each other. So the Olmsted brothers, of course, are and Frederick Law Olmsted is of course, considered the father of landscape architecture. His designs include City Park, Central Park in New York, and the Chicago Columbian Exposition and Stanford University. In 1889, his sons John Charles and Frederick Jr. established the Olmsted Brothers firm. And like I mentioned here, by 1930, they had more than 60 designers and had received more than 4,000 commissions. So Olmsted appointed architect E.C. Whiting to visit Shooter's Hill in 1921. And after inspecting the hill's natural contours, he recommended that the memorial be situated or sited on a southeastern axis by associating it on the round, as he quotes, and the round nose of the hill. He felt the memorial would be better appreciated from both the bottom of the hill and from a great distance. That orientation would have directed the views south from the memorial down towards the Potomac River, which would mean it's facing south down the river rather than due east and west or north towards Washington, D.C. The association quickly rejected this idea to situate the building at almost at a 45-degree angle south and south and east. So they demanded that it be faced due east and west for several reasons. First of all, of course, it would be oriented on King Street, and then also in Freemasonry. Also, we didn't want to have the building overlooking those railroad yards and the freight yards and the roundhouse and the supply dumps that were there before Eisenhower went in. And also in Freemasonry, all Masonic temples should be situated due east and west. So in October 1921, Olmsted associate architect Carl Rust Parker replaced E.C. Whiting. Parker was born in Andover, Massachusetts, and graduated from Phillips Academy in 1901. And he began at Olmsted as a draftsman. And in 1910, he had his own architectural landscape practice in Portland, Maine. But then he later closed his firm and rejoined Olmsted Brothers in 1919. And he was a fellow of American Society of Landscape Architects, and in 1950 became a partner in the firm. So during the fall of 1921 and early 1922, as Harvey Wiley Corbett was working on the designs of the building, a detailed topographic survey of Shooter's Hill was completed, and at the February 1922 annual meeting, both Corbett's memorial design and Parker's landscape designs were presented to the Memorial Association. As hoped, the two architectural plans supported each other's. Corbett's stepped-back neoclassical lighthouse was reflected in Parker's landscape terraced hill. As Corbett's memorial stacked three smaller temples upon a broad plinth, Parker sculpted the hill into a series of broad landings down to King Street. The depth and the rise of each terrace were in proportion to Corbett's memorial design. And here's a basic layout and drawing of rendering of what the design was to look like. The centered walkway climbed flights of stairs as the tower stepped to its peak through smaller temples. Parker also chose a snaking driveway from the bottom of the hill to the front of the memorial, rather than going up, say, further up King Street and taking a left turn and just coming in level to the building. And this is the process where they began to level off the hill. And you can see in the distance there on the right is the house, one of the houses on to the north of the property. Although Parker's and Corbett's unified design was enthusiastically approved by the Memorial Association, the collaboration quickly ended. Like many creative and ambitious people, they started to compete for the Memorial Association's money. Through 1922 and 1923, both men refined their designs and the work was taken in hand, but friction between the men increased, and eventually Parker had to turn to consulting architect Charles Osgood to help him support. So this is the construction project. So the hill was lowered 21 feet to put before the construction began, and then the hill was contoured to follow the design of the memorial. And again, here's another image of that to show you the contouring and the steps of the landing. But it also shows you the area that they just determined needed to be landscaped and the areas that they decided were not really important at that time, even though the Memorial Association owned all the land for the most part that it does today. In the lower left-hand corner below the reservoir is a building, and that was a schoolhouse that was still in use during construction, and I think it was taken down in 1934 or 35, but that was a local school. And you can see that there's a major road that's going up to the job site that comes off of Duke Street, and then of course they're also bringing a lot of stuff off of King Street as well to bring up to the area. And then in the back you can see that it's just been plowed up a great deal, but not fully landscaped as it is going down the hill. So between 1921 and 1923 they excavated more than 86 cubic yards of soil. They subgraded 2,000 yards of walkway. They did the drainage tiles and the bricks, and then they began the planting and other basic work. The good news was that between 1922 and 1923, the association's financial resources were great and growing, and Masonic membership was great and growing. And part of the way the money was raised was, and still today, the memorial receives donations according to the number of members per state. So Freemasons, the Memorial Association, may get $1 per member in each jurisdiction, or when a man joins the Memorial Association, may get a $5 donation. So as membership grows in Freemasonry, more money was coming in to support the building of the Memorial Association. And unfortunately, very fortunately, between 1920 and 1930, Freemasonry in America grew from about 2 million to over 3 million in about 10 years. So there was plenty of good cash flow in the first years of the 20s. So Parker finished his landscape plans in 1923, and while his early designs focused on small trees and shrubs spotted throughout the grounds, his later designs added extensive shrubs and planting along the terraces to highlight the steps. He also added a few selective larger trees and groves to provide depth to the garden and to help scale the memorial temple. And although landscaping continued after 1923, the cost of Corbett's temple began to demand more and more of the association's funds. And through the 1920s, Parker's landscapes slowly grew with every tree and scrub, but his 1923 master plan did not expand and did not come to fruition. So one of the things that happened in the construction is the Memorial Association, the original design said that the top of the building should be clad in limestone, and the Memorial Association made an extraordinary decision to do the whole building in granite, which added about 25% to the total cost of the construction. And when you make those decisions, then other things such as landscaping suffers greatly. So Parker's frustration with Corbett returned in 1928 with the imperative to dedicate the Memorial Temple in 1932 for the Washington bicentennial celebration. He angrily wrote letters to the association president and treasurer Claude Keeper, insisting his plan be pushed forward on the grounds, grass, and walkway, and that plantings would not come to fruition for the dedication unless this happened. Unfortunately, Parker's worst fears happened when the stock market crashed in 1929, and of course all the money that was flowing in suddenly stopped, because not only did Freemasons need to keep their money at home to take care of their own as far as other charities and to help widows and orphans, but also men stopped joining Freemasonry or demitted it because they didn't have the resources to maintain their membership. So the landscaping basically stopped by 1930. On May 12, 1932, the memorial was dedicated, and perhaps it was a revengeful. There's another image of the memorial as it's getting closer. This is, as you can see, the stamp at the top. It's August 15th, 1930, and they're doing the very, very top of the building. And you can see the extent of the landscaping, what was landscaped and what was not landscaped, essentially. And the train station here, and of course there is no Callahan Drive between King Street and Duke Street. That drive was put in, I think, in 1938 or so. And you can see the entrance to the memorial is strictly on King Street, and it snakes completely around as it does today. And then, of course, what's most astounding at all is how empty everything west of Shooters Hill is and how much farmland there is in 1930. So, like I mentioned, per standard operating procedure, the architect and the landscape architect are going to start competing for money fiercely, and then more and more is given to the building and less to the land because they're rushing to get the building done. They must dedicate it in 1932 as part of that bicentennial celebration. And then, of course, the 32 deadline happens, but Mother Nature's revenge. So when they decided to dedicate the memorial, there was 5 days of torrential rain. And so they couldn't do a grand parade. They could do nothing outside. They basically had to do what little parade they could handle. And then the dedication actually took place within the memorial theater, and about 600 people crammed into that theater. And President Hoover showed up for the dedication, but it was, minimal. And this is an image, of course, of that day, and you can see that the memorial is barely finished and that the tower is not enclosed. There's no windows in the tower. Those are still open air. That's how much they had to cut the budget just to get the building done, the exterior of the building done. And this is the same image that I showed you early in the presentation that shows you the extent of the grounds and the area with the building dedicated in 1932. And again, you don't see Callahan Drive put in, and it's always extraordinary to see on your very left-hand side, Telegraph Road is really not even a bridge over the railroad tracks. It's just driving over the railroad tracks in 1932. And now it's, one big, huge, giant beltway and everything else that they've done in the last 10 years. It's extraordinary. Okay, so you can say that it was a shame that the landscape wasn't finished, but it did take all the efforts of Lewis Waters, Charles Callahan, and the Memorial Association just to get the building finished in 1932. And all those Freemasons and leaders were deadly afraid of not finishing it for several reasons. Of course, it would be a great embarrassment because we all remember that, the Washington Monument in DC stood unfinished for many, many years, and Freemasons weren't going to allow that to happen. And also because other fraternal organizations such as the Elks, The Elks built a spectacular building in Chicago as a war memorial, which is still there, and other fraternal organizations were in competition, so to speak, with Freemasons, and the Freemasons were not going to be made the laughing stock of the fraternal world if they couldn't finish a building to their most esteemed brother. So they really had to do everything necessary just to get the building open. So, for example, on that, we'll just talk a little bit briefly through the 1930s and 60s. It took another 18 years before the colossal George Washington statue was able to be put in after World War II. And it was not until 1957 that the elevators went in and visitors could ride to the very top of the building and enjoy that startling vista that was described in the 1917 annual report that started the fundraising process. So during this long period, the Memorial Association's progress slowed considerably, and only a few plantings occurred on the ground. Occasionally, some Masonic organizations donated trees and other things to put on the ground, but the landscape architect Parker, objected to such random placings and plantings because it might cause the possibility that people might view such things as if the memorial was nothing but a cemetery and not a landscape property for George Washington. In 1939, Parker acquired a new ally when the new memorial president, Elmer Arnn, who was from Ohio, he was a medical doctor, but he was also an amateur horticulturist because he grew up on a farm and he had a keen interest in the Ohio Masonic homes, landscape and gardens. Together, they revised and updated the 1923 landscape plan, but unfortunately, little work was done as priorities after the Second War turned to maintaining the long driveway and building the large northwest parking lot, which is there today, which Parker did design the parking lot. And this is just a nice image of looking up Duke Street towards the property to give you a sense of its place in Old Town when it was truly old. So after 1950, when Parker became a partner in Olmsted Brothers, he was no longer involved with the memorial's landscape. His 1923 plans remained essentially unchanged until the late 1960s. In hindsight, President Waters and the association, again, had to do the right thing by completing the building in 1932, but it's just unfortunate that the grounds were never able to be fully funded. And then from the 1970s forward, they had a new plan, commissioned a new plan, the Memorial Association, in 1967-68, and then Kenneth Sorgel of the University of Maryland presented this plan. But again, there was an attempt to do the full plan, but in typical fashion, the needs of that great building, the memorial itself, the physical plant, all that other stuff, just simply sucked up all the money that they tried to raise and tried to put into implementing a proper landscape design. And largely the landscaping was taken care of and maintained, but very little was done. In 1982, they put in better signage and other things on the property, but again, bare minimum. And then the last major event on the landscape was the 1999 Masonic logo, which was dedicated, like I said, in 1999. And here's a nice image from an airplane landing at Reagan Airport, and you can see at the top third of the tower that was I'm sorry, I'm blanking there. That's the workers repointing and cleaning the building about 3 or 4 years ago. And you can see the giant logo, Masonic logo on the front. That was part of the rationale for putting that in, was that somehow people would see the logo when they flew into Reagan Airport and somehow they would be interested in Freemasonry and learning more. It's not something that the Memorial Association feels strongly about it anymore. And it's possible in the years to come that we might remove that logo because it can and often does distract from enjoying the tower and not only enjoying the tower and the architecture of the tower, but also enjoying the landscape, and then also distracts from the idea that this is a building dedicated to George Washington and not dedicated to Freemasonry. So from the year 2000 to and into the future, of course, we started a major tree program planting in 2001, and we've planted over 600 trees on the property. And those trees are been dedicated and donated. People can donate to purchase a tree for in memory of their loved ones or their organizations. We've had improved signage on the property, of course, and then we put in a couple years ago a sidewalk that runs along the driveway up the hill. And then there are other plans and ideas that we're thinking about, but again, things are still focused on finishing the repointed and cleaning of the building, and then also preparing for the cornerstone ceremony in 2023, which we're hoping several hundred Freemasons from around the country. We will rededicate the cornerstone in February of 2023, and that should be a large and major event, and should then start the process of the memorial, hopefully moving back towards more educational. It will signal the end of the repointing and the cleaning and the repairing of the building, and start a process of moving the association back towards its educational mission and a broader outreach to the community and to the nation. And with that, I will say thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions I possibly can with the full knowledge that I do not know everything. So thank you again, and please let me hear your questions.
Thank you, Mark. That was really interesting. I was aware that it took a while to finish the memorial, but I did not realize that it was that much collaboration between so many people. Before we get some questions, I do want to make people aware of an event that's coming up, excuse me, next week on the 30th at 7 p.m. Sponsored by the George Washington Birthday Celebration Committee. And it is going to be a conversation with reenactors portraying George Washington, Martha Washington, and Abigail Adams. And they're going to be discussing the meaning and legacy of the American War for Independence, and tickets are $20 if anybody's interested in that. And let's see, we have a couple questions. With Masons coming from all over the country, were there problems with the Masons coming together, especially the board after the Civil War?
No, not really. There obviously were tensions soon after the American Civil War as the fraternity reunited, as a country reunited after the war. But Freemasonry is fundamentally a fraternal organization, and their purpose is to unite men of all different points of view and religions and beliefs. So obviously there's always that tension that always happens between regions of our country, but I have not seen any of that in any suggested within the Memorial Association. The board at that time was fairly represented between North and South and East and West, though obviously the majority of Freemasons were in the northern states, Pennsylvania and New York, both having well over 150,000 Freemasons in 1920, and they had over 200,000 Freemasons by 1960. And of course, the money coming from the South was less because they were devastated by the war, and it wasn't really until the 1960s that the Southern economy really fully recovered after the Civil War. So I'm sure there was some of that, but it wasn't anything that prevented serious work.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what is the significance of the Egyptian design in the interior of the building?
Right. So there is no, I'm sorry to say, there's nothing Egyptian about the building. So it is predicated on a lighthouse, but it's the lighthouse at Ostia, Rome, not the lighthouse at Alexandria, Egypt. So there were other elements that Harvey Wiley Corbett took from other Greek and Roman temples, but there's nothing Egyptian about the building. And that's, again, another major misconception that has been perpetuated innocently and casually for many, many years, and even that's even been perpetuated by Memorial Association. But the building is based on the lighthouse at Ostia, Rome. It's a Roman lighthouse, not an Egyptian lighthouse. And if you look at the many supposed designs or the belief of what the Egyptian lighthouse at Alexandria looked like, it's not particularly attractive, and it's not particularly like a temple or anything dedicated to the virtues and character of a great man. So it was a functional building.
Okay. And I'm not certain if you have any opinions or can answer this, but can you comment on plans for a one-way cut through for traffic, and some adjustments have been made for traffic stops?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of discussion about that, and I'm sure I don't live in Alexandria. I'm not a citizen of Alexandria, and I'm just an employee of the Memorial Association, and more especially a historian. So I know there's a lot of discussion about that. I know there is a definite need for better pedestrian access there, and I know that the Memorial Association is interested in making it easier for people to be able to go directly from the sidewalk instead of having to go around the island to be able to cut through that. But where that is and how that's going to take place, I don't know. I'm just a historian about those sort of things.
Okay, well, thank you.
Sure.
And out of curiosity, when did you add the colored lights to the building?
Right. So
In the last couple of years.
yeah, so we've slowly added them. Again, it's always a budgetary thing. We never have enough money to specifically do everything that we want right away. And certainly the building has all sorts of demands of its own, but we've been adding lights as we've been repointing and cleaning the building from top to bottom. And we are adding in the last section of lights in the next weeks or so. And so that's just something that came about over a period of years, and it's now coming to full fruition as we finish the exterior of the building. But again, with COVID and with, we were closed, obviously, in our, like every institution and every organization, the financial resources are not as strong as they were. So things got delayed and postponed, but I do think that would be finished, and we do as much as we possibly can, or accommodate those who request that stuff, and we're happy to do that where it's appropriate, I suppose.
Well, I know it's exciting to see,
Yeah.
and I know people posted on Facebook, and everybody's like, I
Yeah.
drove by and
Yeah.
these are the colors. So
Sure.
it's
Yes.
really nice to put that in the neighborhood. And we have a thank you for this history and preservation of an iconic
Oh,
landscape.
that's good. Thank you. We're doing our best. We have a long ways to go, but it's a really extraordinary thing how much the Memorial Association, with the executive director George Sagers, over the last 20 years has achieved, both in interior of the building and making the building handicapped accessible, and the amount of events and use for public. Before 1999, there's very few functions, very few connections to the cities, and now we do weddings and corporate events and plays and concerts and graduations. And then we always want to do more on the property, and we've talked about that, but then again, COVID hit, and we're going through all that process. So it's hopefully that we can do more of that stuff. We just haven't, as usual, so
Yeah.
yeah. But certainly the future is much more brighter to do more and more within the citizens of Alexandria, within the neighborhood around the memorial, and in general.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
a beautiful place up there. I know I did a contract for the lodge there and got to work with you, and
Mm-hmm.
growing up we went there to watch fireworks. Again, it's just a beautiful place.
Sure.
I'm gonna wait just to see if anybody wants to put one or two. It says one of the elevator ad, but I'm pretty sure that was 57.
Yeah, so there's two elevators, and one was put in, I think, in 57, and the other was 59.
Okay.
And if you wanted to go to the very top before that, you had literally had to walk up the stairs. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. And the elevators, I don't know if you can describe them because
Sure. So the
they're
elevators
really
are on
unique,
track.
but it's probably better when you're there to see it.
Yeah, the elevators move at a 6-degree incline inward, like a pyramid, and they're on tracks and rails. So at the base of the memorial, they're about 60 feet apart, and when you get to the very top at the observation deck, they're about 10 feet apart. Yes. Yeah.
It's really neat.
They're quite particular, and again, they weren't put in because they just didn't have the money to do that, and they didn't have the money obviously until after World War II, and then there were still other priorities before they got the elevators in.
Right.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much for presenting this wonderful and informative lecture. People interested in Alexandria Historical Society events, make sure to check out our website for upcoming events and lectures. Sorry, that's my dog giving the approval. And we're going to see you in the fall on Wednesday, September 22nd at 2021 at 7:30 for our first fall lecture. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, everybody. Take care and good night.